Hey everybody, and welcome to this video on independent and dependent variables and quantities. Here we go. Alright, so in the near future, we're going to be creating equations, drawing graphs, and modeling all sorts of real-world situations. And in each of these situations, we're going to have two quantities that are related to one another. For instance, how much money you earn and how long you work for, how well you score on a history test and how long you study for, your electricity bill and how many hours you left the AC on this month, how long an electrician works on fixing your cable box and how much you have to pay him, or the number of views that a YouTube video has and how long it's been since it was posted. And one definition that I want to start with right off the bat is dependent and independent quantities. If we're considering the relationship between two quantities, where one quantity, let's call it y, depends on another quantity, let's call that one x, then we would say y is the dependent quantity or variable, and x is the independent quantity or variable. Now note, I use x and y because very often the dependent variable can also be thought of as an output to a function or rule, and the independent variable can often be thought of as the input to a function or a rule. This isn't going to be true 100% of the time, but almost always that's going to be the case, so we can make that connection between dependent variable and output and independent variable and input. This also means that much of the time we'll place our independent quantity or independent variable on the horizontal axis of a graph if we're graphing a relationship, and we'll place the dependent quantity or the dependent variable on the vertical axis of a graph if we're graphing the relationship. Alright, let's actually visit some real-world relationships between two quantities and figure out which one is independent and which one is dependent. For instance, the relationship between how much money you earn and how long you work for. Now, most of the time, we're actually going to use intuition to figure out what our dependent and independent quantities and variables are. We're not really going to have a formula or an algorithm that we can use, although I do have some tips and strategies to help. If intuition doesn't seem to be helping you figure out which one is which, you can try this. Take a look at these two statements below and try inserting the two quantities into the blanks and seeing which makes more sense to you. And when it makes sense, you'll see next to the blank dv for dependent variable or iv for independent variable, so you know which one is which. For instance, which makes more sense? How much money you earn depends on how long you work for, or how long you work for depends on how much money you earn. I think it makes much more sense that how much money you earn depends on how long you work for. So that tells us how much money you earn is the dependent variable and how long you work for is the independent variable. Or how about this next one? Let's try it both ways. How much money you earn determines how long you work for, or how long you work for determines how much money you earn. That second one sounds a lot better, which tells us, like before, how long you work for is your independent variable, and how much money you earn is your dependent variable. So, for each of the next four, I'd like you to try that first tip, or use your intuition, to determine which of the two quantities is your independent quantity or variable, and which of the two is your dependent quantity or variable. So, why don't you pause the video now, give those a try, and when you're done, unpause the video, and we'll reconvene. Yet another strategy you can use is to insert the two quantities into the blanks of the following statement and see which makes more sense to you. As blank increases or decreases, blank increases or decreases. And if that makes sense, the first blank will be your independent variable and your second blank will be your dependent variable. Alright, let's look at some tougher examples. And in each of these, a hypothetical situation is going to be given. And what we first need to do is determine what two quantities there are that are changing and related to one another. And we want to be really, really specific about what these quantities are. After that, then we'll need to determine which is the dependent variable or quantity and which is the independent variable or quantity. So for instance, you drive at a constant rate of 50 miles per hour. I think that the two quantities here are how long you've been driving in hours and how far you've been driving in miles. In this case, I think the dependent quantity is how far you've driven in miles, and the independent quantity will be how long you've driven in hours. In the next example, you pay $2.50 for every subway ride that you take. Here I think the two quantities are how much you've spent on subway rides and how many subway rides you take. In this case, how much you spend is going to depend on how many rides you take. So our dependent quantity will be how much we spend in dollars, and our independent quantity will be how many subway rides we take. In the third example, the population of the United States has increased by about 2.5 million people each year since 1920. So here we'll say that the two quantities are the population of the United States, probably going to be in millions, and the other quantity is how many years it's been since 1920. That's so important to say since 1920. In this case, I think the population depends on how many years it's been since 1920. So the dependent quantity is the population of the United States, probably in millions, and the independent quantity will be how many years it's been since 1920. And in general, if there's ever a statement such as per blank or each blank or every blank, as there were in each of the previous three examples, then that quantity is almost always going to be the independent quantity. One last tip that I find very helpful is, in general, if one of the quantities being considered is a pure time quantity, like seconds or weeks or days or years, then that quantity will generally be the independent variable or independent quantity. So, to finish up, here are 6 more hypothetical situations, and for each, I'd like you to determine the two quantities that are being related and be very specific about that, and then determine which is the dependent quantity and which is the independent quantity. So in the first example, our dependent quantity is going to be the United States debt in dollars, and our independent quantity is going to be the number of years since 1990. In our second example, the dependent quantity is going to be the population of the United States, and the independent quantity is going to be the number of years since 1880. In our third example, the dependent quantity is going to be how many workers the company has hired or how many workers the company has, and the independent quantity is going to be how many months it's been since February. In the fourth example, the dependent quantity is going to be the stock price of that company in dollars, and the independent quantity is going to be the number of weeks since July 23rd. In our fifth example, the dependent quantity is going to be the number of views on that YouTube video, and the independent quantity is going to be the number of days since that YouTube video was posted. In our last example, the dependent quantity is going to be the number of retweets that celebrity got, and the independent quantity is going to be the number of minutes since 11:37 a.m. Alright guys, that's it for this video. I hope you found it helpful, and I hope you enjoyed.